Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, my guest today gained worldwide fame about 20 years ago with a provocative book in which he argued that the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall marked the triumph of Western liberal democracy. It was, Francis Fukuyama asserted, the culmination of mankind's ideological evolution and the end of history as such. The end of history, perhaps, but for Fukuyama, it was just the beginning of a new battle to defend himself against critics who, he says, misunderstood and often misinterpreted what he actually meant by the end of history. Now, along the way, Mr. Fukuyama has written several more books, 7 in all, including his most recent one, which we will be talking about today, The Origins of Political Order. He traces the roots of today's modern political institutions. Francis Fukuyama, thank you for joining us. You are joining us from Stanford University, where you are currently a senior fellow. Now, I'm going to try.
Yes, thank you.
Bear with me for a moment, because I know you're probably tired of people asking you to explain and explain again the end of history. But given all that's happened since he wrote the original essay 23 years ago, the Arab Spring, 9/11, the rapid rise of China, can you understand why so many people were so quick to jump down your throat?
Well, sure. The basic confusion really revolves around the use of the word history. I was using it in the sense of Karl Marx and the German philosopher Hegel, who saw history as a progressive evolution of institutions and economies. And my argument was not that events would stop happening, rather that we seem to be evolving in a certain direction, and that direction did not, as Marx said, point towards communism. Rather, it pointed towards liberal democracy and a market economy. And so in that sense, I still believe that that fundamental insight is correct. I don't see that there's a higher form of civilization that lies beyond liberal democracy to which we're aspiring at the moment. And I think that, in a way, the Arab Spring is an indication that this part of the world in the Middle East that people had thought was culturally different and would not participate in this evolution seems to have aspirations in that direction as well. So that was the fundamental argument that I was making that I still think is valid.
You said something else interesting since the end of history came out. It was in one interview, I'm not sure when you actually said it, that people want to live in a modern society, but not necessarily a democratic society. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, I think that democracy is not something that universally exists. The desire for democracy does not universally exist. In the West, it didn't exist 200 years ago in most European countries. I think that it's something that emerges as people modernize, as their living standards increase. And so all over the world, for example, the demand for democracy has really been driven by the emergence of a middle class, people with a little bit more income, some possessions that can be taken away by the government, higher levels of education. And it's out of that social group that historically the demand for liberal democracy has come. And you see this, I think, in the Middle East today, and you see it in China.
And also, I'm going to just add Russia as well. I'm just wondering, because, and I'm getting right now to your more recent book. In French, the title of it is actually The Beginning of History, which resonates back to the earlier book. Was that your choice? That was a French publisher's choice? Because it's not the same in English. It's The Origins of Political Order in English.
It was my publisher's choice, but in a way, it's not a wrong or terrible title, because part of the purpose of the new book is, in a sense, to recognize how difficult it is to establish political institutions, democracy, the rule of law, the state itself. I think that in rethinking my argument, this is probably the realization that I've come to over the years, is that the formation of these institutions was actually a pretty difficult process. It's not something that can be taken for granted. It often depended on historical accident and sequences of events that oftentimes are difficult to replicate.
And just as easily...
And that's one of the reasons.
And just as easily, you say in your book that if circumstances change and societies, the institutions fail to adapt, that society can just come crumbling down.
Well, that was the other, I think, part of the argument that was missing in my earlier work, which was the notion of political decay. I think that all societies are subject to political decay. A lot of times it's a matter of elites that manage to gain power and protect their positions over time. It could be the failure to adapt because human institutions tend to get pretty rigid. And this is not just true of older forms of government, it's true of liberal democracies. And I think in many modern democratic societies, you see some symptoms of political decay today.
Let's look at where you are right now. You're in Stanford in the United States. Just had a very big election there, an election which many people would say was marked by tremendous polarization. We keep hearing this word with the U.S. Do you see, is this a sign, perhaps in your opinion, that the U.S. is reaching, it's stretching the limit of the sustainability of its model, or is this just a passing phase?
Well, we fundamentally don't know that. The United States has got a political system based on checks and balances. And at the moment, the way it's working is that the checks are so strong that it's impossible to reach basic agreement on things like how we deal with our long-term budget problem, how we deal with the problem of rising inequality in the society, which I think is probably the driver of a lot of the social discontent that exists in America today. And that is, something that in the past the United States has risen, at moments of crisis to solve these problems. But I don't think there's any necessary guarantee that we'll have the right leadership or even the right institutions to handle this in the future.
It's interesting because in your book you say that a lot of the classically historians look at the European model of democracies and they ask why other countries have deviated from that model or failed to attain it. You look at China, you say it's perhaps the earliest state builder in the entire world, and you ask why did states not follow China's path? You're looking at it from the other perspective.
That's right. Well, I do think that there is a very Eurocentric view of world history. My argument was not that China built the first state, but it built the first really modern state, meaning centralized, bureaucratic, impersonal, based on merit. And they did this in the 3rd century BC. And I think that in European historiography, there's never been an adequate recognition of the fact that the Chinese were the first to create this kind of institution. The problem is that they didn't create a rule of law, and they didn't create democratic accountability, and they didn't foster a capitalist revolution. And so there are a lot of missing things in that Chinese formula, but they did get to the modern state first.
So when you look at, say, the recent, the Communist Party Congress in China, which just wrapped up this week, do you see a democracy that is functioning in its own way given Chinese circumstances, or is there something inherently dysfunctional about that?
Well, no, I think it's a very unbalanced system. They've got a modern state, but if you have a modern state that's not constrained by a strong rule of law or democratic accountability, what you have is a more perfect tyranny. And the Chinese are pretty good at running an authoritarian system, but I think that there's very little transparency, and although they try to be responsive to citizen complaints, they really do need to balance their system. So in other words, if the United States is over on one side with, I think, excessive checks and balances on power, the Chinese are way over at the other extreme with a very powerful state that doesn't have very many checks. And that's really their challenge in the next few years, is to regularize and check power through law and democracy.
Francis Fukuyama, author, political science professor, Stanford University. I'd like to thank you very much for being my guest today. Original essay author of The End of History. 23 years later, no, history hasn't stopped. It does move on, and you have a new book out. The Beginning of History is its title in French, and it looks at the origins of political institutions. Thanks to all of you for watching the interview here on France 24.